wrongfully convicted of rape. His fight for justice and the deadly trials ahead. Hook. What if everything you knew about your life was a lie? He was wrongfully convicted of a crime he didn't commit, and now, as enemies close in, the truth is his only chance at survival. Will he escape in time, or will the dark forces that framed him catch him first? Watch until the end to uncover the shocking twist that could change everything. He walked into the courtroom, his heart racing. The air felt thick. The whispers of the crowd echoed around him. Everyone was watching. He was accused of something he didn't do. The case was built on lies, but no one believed him. The prosecutor painted him as a monster, a man who had committed unspeakable acts. But he knew the truth. The woman who accused him, her words were false. Her accusations were the weapon she wielded against him. He never thought it would happen to him. The trial felt endless, each day dragging him deeper into the abyss. He could feel their eyes on him. The jury, the judge, the people in the gallery. They all stared, judging. Each moment felt like a slow suffocation. His lawyer tried to defend him, but the evidence was twisted. A lie was believed, and he was bound by it. The woman who accused him spoke with such conviction. Her voice trembled with fake sincerity. Her eyes never wavered from his, filled with a cold certainty. But he could feel the weight of the injustice pressing down on him. The world was moving in slow motion. The walls of the courtroom seemed to close in. He could taste the bitterness of defeat on his tongue. The sentence came, and it was harsh. The judge's voice cut through the silence. Guilty. His world shattered in an instant. As the guards moved toward him, his body went numb. The courtroom seemed to blur. The faces of the spectators felt distant, like they were part of a nightmare he couldn't wake from. How could this be happening? He didn't understand. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built was gone. He was no longer a free man. He was trapped in a nightmare of someone else's making. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. He was taken to prison. The bars clanged shut behind him. The reality of it all began to sink in. This wasn't just a trial. This was his life now. His future was slipping away, piece by piece. The other inmates looked at him differently, some with sympathy, others with disdain. They knew what he was accused of. His name was no longer his own. It was tainted. The whispers followed him everywhere, but he kept quiet. He didn't know who to trust anymore. His mind raced constantly, searching for an answer. How had everything gone so wrong? How could they let this happen? Days passed, each one blurring into the next. He became a shadow of the man he once was. The weight of his wrongful conviction hung heavy on his shoulders. But deep inside, something sparked, a glimmer of hope. He couldn't let this be the end. He would fight. He would prove his innocence. The truth was out there. He just had to find it. And as he lay on his cold prison bed, the resolve grew stronger. He would not rest until justice was served. He began to plan. Every night after the lights went out, he would sit in the dark. His mind was alive, searching for clues, piecing together what had happened. He knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed help. But who could he trust in this place? One day, a new inmate arrived, a man who seemed out of place. He was quiet, observant, and looked like he had his own story to tell. The man sat in the corner of the common area, his eyes scanning the room. Their gazes met. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the man stood and walked over. "Your case, it's not over," he said, his voice low. His words sent a chill down the man's spine. How did this stranger know about him? "I've been watching you," the man continued. He looked around, making sure no one was listening. "You've been wronged just like me. I can help you." The man didn't know whether to trust him, but something in the stranger's eyes made him believe. There was a fire in them, a determination that mirrored his own. "Why would you help me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The stranger leaned in closer. Because I know what it feels like to be trapped in a lie, he said. The man's heart skipped a beat. This stranger knew. He wasn't the only one who had been wronged. Who are you? The man asked. A man with nothing to lose, the stranger replied. With that, they formed an unspoken alliance. They began to talk in secret. Late at night, they would exchange stories. The stranger knew people on the outside, investigators, journalists, people who could help. He had connections. The man listened carefully, soaking in every word. They talked about the trial, the false evidence, the lies told in the courtroom. But most of all, they talked about the woman who had accused him, the woman who had ruined his life. They needed to find her, find the truth, expose her lies. But as they spoke, a new fear began to settle in. What if they were being watched? What if the walls had ears? Their plan had to remain a secret. One wrong move, and everything could be lost. The tension in the air thickened with every passing day. The man couldn't afford to make a mistake, but he knew that the only way out was through the truth. And with the stranger's help, he was starting to believe it was possible. But deep down, he could feel something darker brewing. Someone was watching him. Someone who would stop at nothing to keep the truth buried. And soon, the danger would come for him. He could sense it. Every night, the man sat in his cell, heart racing, eyes darting around. Was someone watching? He couldn't shake the feeling. It was as though the walls had ears. The air had eyes. The stranger was always there, but even he seemed more cautious now. The whispers had grown louder. More inmates were talking about him, about his case. But it wasn't just idle gossip. It was suspicion. Something wasn't right. Then one day, the unexpected happened. A guard came to his cell. "You're needed in the warden's office," the man said, his voice flat. The man's stomach dropped. This was it. He followed the guard down the narrow hallway, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the silence. The warden sat behind his desk, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He didn't speak at first, just watched him. The air felt heavy, suffocating. Finally, the warden leaned forward, his voice low. "We've been keeping an eye on you," he said, his eyes narrowing. A cold shiver ran down the man's spine. "What do you mean?" "Your little talks, your plans," the warden replied. The man's heart skipped a beat. Had they known all along? The warden's eyes gleamed, a twisted smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You've been digging into things that don't concern you," he said. The man's mind raced. What did he know? Was the warden involved? His thoughts were interrupted as the warden continued. "We're very protective of our own here. You understand, don't you?" The man's blood ran cold. The walls were closing in. He had to be careful. One wrong word could send everything crashing down. He nodded, trying to keep his composure. "Yes, I understand." But in his mind, the wheels were turning. The warden had said too much. He was involved. But how deep did it go? The warden leaned back in his chair. "You'll be transferred soon," he said, his tone final. "Transferred, yes, to a different facility. You'll be safer there. This place isn't the best for someone like you." The man's pulse quickened. He knew what that meant. A different facility could mean isolation. It could mean everything he had fought for. His connection with the stranger, his chance to uncover the truth, would be lost. The warden stood. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he warned. And just like that, the man's world tilted once again. He was being moved. The chance to expose the lies, to find the truth, was slipping away. As the guard led him back to his cell, the man's mind raced. The stranger, he couldn't let him go. He had to act and fast. The walls were closing in, but he would not be silenced. Not now. Not ever. His fight for justice was just beginning. The man lay on his bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, his mind a whirlwind. He had to get out. He had to find the truth. He couldn't let the warden win. He couldn't let the lies trap him forever. He knew the clock was ticking. The transfer was imminent. If he was moved, it would be over. Everything he had worked for, the conversations with the stranger, the scraps of evidence they had uncovered, would be lost. But the man couldn't sit idly by. His body tensed as he listened to the sounds of the prison. The shuffle of feet in the hall, the clink of metal. Each noise felt amplified, like the world was closing in around him. The plan was risky, but it was his only option. He had no choice. He waited until the dead of night. When the guard's footsteps grew fainter, he knew it was time. He crept out of his cell, his breath shallow. His heart thudded in his chest. The prison was eerily quiet. He had memorized the layout of the building over the months, every corner, every turn. The man knew where the records were kept, the files, the truth. He moved swiftly, his feet silent on the cold concrete floor. He had to be quick. If he was caught, it would be the end. He reached the security office, his pulse pounding in his ears. There was no guard in sight. He pushed the door open, praying the lock wouldn't creak. Inside, the room was dark, the only light coming from the glow of a computer screen. He knew what he had to do. He found the drawer where the case files were kept. His fingers trembled as he pulled it open. There they were, the files on his case. He skimmed through them, his heart racing with every page he turned. But something wasn't right. The evidence was all wrong. Twisted, manipulated. His head spun. This wasn't just a false conviction. It was a setup. Someone had orchestrated this. But who? Who had the power to frame him like this? He needed answers. Just as he was about to take the files, a noise pierced the silence. A door opening. His heart stopped. He quickly stuffed the files under his jacket. He had to leave now. He turned, moving toward the exit. But then a shadow appeared in the doorway. It was the stranger. The man's stomach dropped. "What are you doing here?" the stranger whispered, his eyes wide with panic. "I came for the files. I found the truth," the man whispered back, his voice urgent. But the stranger looked around, anxiety written all over his face. "They'll know. They'll come for you. Not if I can get out of here." The stranger's gaze hardened. "No, it's too dangerous. You can't leave now. They're watching. I've been watching too." The man froze. "Watching?" "Yes," the stranger whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "I've been gathering information. I've known for a while. They're onto you. It's not just the warden. They have eyes everywhere." The man's blood ran cold. "So, what now?" "Now," the stranger said, his voice low. "We need to disappear. Together." The man's mind raced. Disappearing meant leaving everything behind. His fight for justice, the chance to expose the truth. But if he stayed, he knew it would be the end. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He had a choice to make. Fight or flee. And the clock was ticking. The man's heart pounded in his chest, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Disappearing meant leaving everything behind. But staying meant certain death, metaphorically if not literally. The stranger's eyes bore into him, filled with an urgency that matched his own fear. "Come on," the stranger urged. "We don't have time." The man glanced at the files in his jacket. The truth so close yet so far. If he ran, he might never get the chance to prove his innocence. But if he stayed, the walls would close in on him. The truth buried forever. The decision was suffocating. "We can't do this alone," the man muttered, his voice strained. The stranger nodded grimly. "We won't be alone. I know people who can help. I can get us out." The man hesitated. But then, the distant sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. The guards were coming. Time was up. His pulse quickened. "All right," he whispered, his decision made. "Let's go." They rushed down the dark hallway, their footsteps soft but urgent. The man's thoughts were jumbled. He couldn't think about what he was leaving behind. The files were hidden beneath his jacket, but the truth was a heavy weight in his chest. Was it possible to escape and fight for justice at the same time? Could he really outrun the system that had trapped him? The stranger led him through winding corridors, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows. They reached a hidden door in the back of the prison, a door that led to an underground passage. The man had never known it existed. The stranger glanced over his shoulder before pulling the door open. "After you," he said, urgency in his voice. The man stepped into the dark, damp tunnel, feeling the cold air hit his skin. It smelled of dirt and decay, but it was their only chance. The walls seemed to close in around them, the tunnel narrow and claustrophobic. Every step felt like a lifetime, every sound amplified in the silence. The man's breath quickened, his heart thumping. He didn't know where this tunnel would lead, but it was their only way out. "We'll be out of here soon," the stranger whispered. "Don't stop. Keep moving." The man nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. What if they were walking straight into a trap? What if they weren't really escaping at all? But there was no turning back. They kept moving through the pitch black, the air thick with tension. Suddenly, the tunnel opened up, and they emerged into the night. The moonlight felt like a distant dream, the fresh air a reminder that the world was still out there. They were free for now, but they weren't safe yet. The man's heart raced. They had escaped the prison, but the real danger had only just begun. There was someone watching, someone who would stop at nothing to keep the truth buried. And the man knew, deep in his bones, that this was just the beginning of the fight. As they vanished into the night, one thing was certain. The chase was on. The night air was cold, sharp against his skin. The man took a deep breath, his lungs burning as he filled them with the freedom he hadn't felt in so long. But even as they stood outside, the darkness pressing in around them, he knew this was just the calm before the storm. They couldn't stop. The stranger's eyes darted nervously, scanning the area. "We've got to move fast," he urged. The man nodded, his mind still racing. Where would they go? Who could they trust now? Every step they took felt like they were being watched, like shadows were stretching toward them. The world felt smaller somehow, more dangerous. But there was no turning back. The stranger pulled him toward a narrow alley, the dim light from a nearby street lamp barely cutting through the gloom. "We have to find my contact," the stranger whispered. "Who's that?" "Someone who can help us get off the radar, but they won't do it for free." The man's stomach twisted. "I don't care about the price," he said, his voice hard. "If they can help us, we'll pay whatever it takes." The stranger's lips curled into a tight smile. "That's what I thought you'd say. Let's go." They kept moving, slipping through the streets like ghosts. Every turn, every corner felt like it could be their last. Every passing car, every distant sound of footsteps made the man's heart skip a beat. Was someone following them? Had the guards already caught up? The stranger led him through winding back alleys, passing by darkened storefronts and empty streets. Finally, they stopped in front of a nondescript building tucked away in the shadows. The stranger knocked 3 times, a rhythmic pattern that seemed almost too quiet in the silence of the night. The door creaked open, revealing a tall figure standing in the doorway. It was a man, his face partially obscured by the darkness. "Who's this?" the stranger asked, his voice guarded. "This is the man I told you about," the stranger replied. "He needs help." The tall man studied the man closely, his gaze piercing. The air between them was thick with tension. Finally, the tall man nodded, stepping aside. "Come in," he said, his voice low and rough. They entered, the door shutting behind them with a soft click. The room was dimly lit, filled with old furniture and the smell of stale smoke. The tall man motioned for them to sit. "What's the situation?" he asked, his eyes flicking from the stranger to the man. "They know we escaped," the stranger said quickly. "We need to disappear now." The tall man's gaze sharpened. "And you," he said, pointing at the man, "are the one they're after?" The man nodded, his throat dry. "They've framed me for something I didn't do," he said. "I need to find the truth." The tall man's expression softened for a moment. "You've been wronged, I can see that. But escaping was the easy part. Now the real fight begins." The man swallowed hard, fear mixing with a glimmer of hope. "We need a plan," he said, his voice steadier now. "We need to find the people responsible and expose them, no matter the cost." The tall man leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. "There's a network of people who can help you," he said slowly. "People who've been through this before. But you're going to have to be smart about it. They'll be watching you every step of the way." The man felt his resolve harden. He wasn't going to be a victim anymore. He was going to find the truth, and he would take down anyone who stood in his way. The tall man looked at him with a hard, calculating gaze. "You're not ready for what's coming," he warned. The man met his eyes, unflinching. "I'm ready," he said. And with that, the next chapter of his fight for justice began. The danger was far from over. But this time, he wasn't going to be silent. This time, he would fight until the truth came to light. The tall man studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. "All right," he said finally, "but know this, you're stepping into a war. And in this game, nothing is as it seems." The man's heart beat faster. War. He'd been fighting for his freedom, his innocence, but this was something else. The tall man leaned forward, his voice low and serious. "There's a network of people who've been wronged, just like you. They call themselves the Forgotten. But they're not just victims. They're warriors in their own right. They've been hiding in the shadows for years, waiting for someone brave enough to take on the system." The man swallowed hard. Could he really join them? Was he ready for what was ahead? The stranger stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "Do you trust him?" The man looked at the tall man, then back at the stranger. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I don't have a choice." The tall man smiled grimly. "Good, because you'll need to trust me if we're going to get anywhere." He stood up and walked toward a metal filing cabinet, pulling open a drawer. Inside, there were maps, old documents, and photographs pinned to the walls. "This is the map of their operations," the tall man said, pointing to a series of locations marked in red. The man's eyes widened as he took in the details. "Who are they?" he asked. "The people who framed you. The ones behind this mess," the tall man said, his voice filled with contempt. "They're powerful connected, but not invincible." The man leaned forward, his eyes scanning the map. He couldn't believe it. There were places, names, dates, everything he needed to bring the truth to light. This was his chance to strike back. "This is where we start," the tall man said, tapping the map. The man nodded, his resolve firming up. But something in the back of his mind nagged at him. How far did this web of corruption stretch? Who could he really trust? The tall man met his gaze, sensing the questions brewing in his mind. "You'll learn quickly," he said. "The truth doesn't come easy, and the people who have it will do anything to keep it buried." The stranger's voice interrupted. "We can't wait. They're coming for us. We need to move now." The tall man nodded, reaching for a duffel bag by his desk. "We've got everything we need, but it's not just about getting the truth. It's about surviving long enough to expose it." The man's heart raced as the tall man handed him a bundle of clothes, a phone, and a few $100s. "Here's your cover," the tall man said. "New identity, new life. You'll need it. They'll be looking for you." The man took the items, his hands shaking slightly. "Thank you," he muttered, but the words felt hollow. They were still far from safe, and the journey ahead would be filled with danger, deceit, and more lies than he could possibly imagine. But there was no turning back now. The truth had a price, and he was willing to pay it. "Are you ready?" the stranger asked, his voice calm but urgent. The man glanced at him, then at the tall man, who gave him a reassuring nod. "I'm ready," he said. And with that, the chase began again. But this time, he wasn't running from the truth. He was running toward it. And no matter how dark the road ahead might get, he was determined to find it, to expose the ones who had stolen his freedom. The real fight had just begun. The night was still, the only sound their footsteps echoing on the cracked pavement as they moved through the streets, blending into the shadows. The man's heart was pounding, but he kept his eyes ahead, forcing himself to stay focused. He couldn't afford to make a mistake now. His entire future, the truth he so desperately needed, was riding on these next few hours. They passed through dark alleyways, under flickering streetlights, always keeping to the shadows. The stranger led the way, glancing over his shoulder every few steps, ever watchful. The tension between them was thick, the weight of what they were about to do pressing heavily on the man's chest. "Where are we going?" the man asked, his voice low. The stranger didn't answer immediately, his gaze flicking toward the street ahead. "We need to meet someone. They're the only ones who can help us with the next step. And who's that? You'll see soon enough." They continued walking in silence, the man's mind spinning. Every step felt like it could be his last. What if they were being led into a trap? What if this was all part of someone's plan to make sure he never found the truth? He couldn't let himself think like that. There was no turning back. They turned a corner, and the stranger stopped abruptly. Ahead, there was a rundown building with boarded-up windows. It looked abandoned, forgotten. But something about it didn't sit right with the man. This was no ordinary place. "Is this it?" the man asked, his voice tinged with doubt. The stranger nodded, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "This is where the people who want to take down the system gather. The ones who have the resources to help you." Before the man could speak, the door creaked open, and a figure stepped out. The man's breath caught in his throat. It was a woman, tall and imposing, dressed in dark clothes. Her eyes were sharp, calculating. "You must be the one they're talking about," she said, her voice low but steady. The stranger nodded. "She's the one we've been looking for," the stranger explained, his voice almost reverent. The woman gave a small, knowing smile. "I hope you're ready for what comes next," she said, stepping aside to let them enter. They walked into the building, which smelled of damp wood and dust, a sharp contrast to the chill of the night air. The woman led them down a narrow hallway and into a room at the back. Inside, a few people sat around a table, their faces obscured by the dim light. One of them stood up as they entered, his gaze fixed on the man. "You're the one who was framed, huh?" he said, his voice gruff. The man nodded, swallowing hard. "I need to find the truth. I need to make them pay for what they've done to me." The woman's eyes narrowed, and she stepped closer to him. "That's not something that can be done easily," she said, her voice cold. "But we can help you. But first," she paused, studying him. "Are you willing to sacrifice everything?" The man's throat tightened. Sacrifice? He had already lost so much, his freedom, his dignity, his sense of trust. How much more would he have to give to find the truth? "I'm willing to do whatever it takes," he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. The woman looked him over, a faint glimmer of approval in her eyes. "Good," she said, "because this is going to get worse before it gets better." The room seemed to close in on him. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom anymore. He was fighting for something much bigger, something far more dangerous. And as the woman turned to her companions, the man knew that the real battle had just begun. The world he once knew, his life, his truth, was slipping further away. But he would keep pushing forward. He had to, for the sake of his freedom, for the sake of justice, and for the truth that had been buried for far too long. The woman's voice cut through the thick silence of the room. "We have eyes everywhere," she said, her tone serious. The man's nerves tightened. Eyes everywhere? Who were these people? The woman pulled a map from the table, spreading it out before him. "This is where you start," she said, pointing to a series of locations on the map, each marked with a red circle. The man leaned in, his breath catching as he scanned the locations. These weren't just random places. They were the heart of the operation, the key points where the conspiracy had taken root. The people who had framed him, the ones who had twisted the truth, were connected here. But it was more than just his case. These circles marked the spots where they had buried countless others, where corruption ran deep. "This is bigger than you think," the woman continued, her voice low. "Much bigger." The man's chest tightened. What had he gotten himself into? The woman's eyes softened, just for a moment. "We've been tracking these people for years," she said. "We know who they are. We know what they've done. But we can't take them down by ourselves." One of the men at the table added, his voice rough. "We need you to be the spark. We need you to expose them." The man's pulse quickened. "Expose them? How?" "I don't even know where to start," he admitted, the weight of everything pressing down on him. "We'll start with one of the locations," the woman said. "Get in, gather what you can, and get out before anyone notices. We'll help you. We have resources." She glanced at the others around the table. "But you need to be careful. They're watching. Always watching." The man's mind spun. There were no guarantees. He couldn't afford to fail. "Okay," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos inside. "I'll do it. I'll start with the first location." The woman nodded, her expression hardening. "You have to be fast. Once you've gathered what you need, get to the rendezvous point. We'll be there to help you. But if you're caught..." Her words hung in the air, unspoken, yet carrying all the weight of the threat. The man's heart beat louder in his ears. He was about to walk into the lion's den. Every instinct screamed at him to back out, to find another way. But there was no other way. Not now. He had made the choice. The truth was within reach, but it was also guarded by shadows, by danger, by those who would stop at nothing to keep him quiet. The woman turned and motioned for him to follow. "Let's get you ready," she said, her voice sharp. She led him into another room, where bags of supplies were waiting. "Take what you need," she said. He grabbed a few items, flash drives, a burner phone, a small camera. Nothing too much, but enough to gather evidence. He had no illusions about how dangerous this was. The truth wasn't free. He could feel it now, deep in his gut. The stakes were higher than he'd ever imagined. The moment he stepped out of that building, everything would change. No more hiding. No more pretending. It was all or nothing. "Ready?" the woman asked, standing by the door. He nodded. He didn't know if he was ready, but there was no time to question it. With one last glance at the room full of people, faces he barely knew, but who had somehow become his only allies, he stepped out into the night. The street was eerily quiet, the cool air biting against his skin. The man couldn't shake the feeling that every corner, every shadow, held a threat. But there was no turning back now. He had to keep moving, for the truth, for the justice that was long overdue, and for the hope that someday he might be free. The man's footsteps echoed in the empty street, a rhythmic beat of urgency. Each step carried him farther from the only life he had known, and closer to the unknown dangers that lurked ahead. His heart raced, and his thoughts were a blur. He could barely remember the route they'd mapped out for him, every direction a haze in his mind. But the reality of it, the danger, the truth was sharp, undeniable. There was no room for mistakes, no room for hesitation. As he turned a corner, the streetlights flickered, casting long shadows across the road. The silence was almost suffocating. The man quickened his pace, glancing over his shoulder, feeling the weight of every passing moment. He had no idea who was watching or when they might strike. A shiver ran down his spine. The first location on the map was just ahead, an old, decrepit building that had once served as a warehouse. But now, it was a front for something far more sinister. He paused for a moment, crouching low beside a rusted dumpster. The building loomed in front of him, its windows dark and empty. He couldn't afford to make any noise. The slightest misstep could alert them. Slowly, carefully, he moved toward the back of the building, where a narrow alley led to a hidden entrance. His breath was shallow, his every sense on high alert. He pressed his back against the cold brick wall, listening. Nothing. But he knew that wasn't a good sign. There were always eyes watching. He turned the corner and saw the entrance, a small, unmarked door. With a shaky hand, he reached for the handle. It creaked open. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the faint smell of chemicals and something older, something more dangerous. He stepped inside, moving silently through the dimly lit corridors. The walls seemed to close in around him, the dark passages twisting and turning in ways he couldn't quite follow. Every footstep echoed louder than it should. He kept his breath steady, trying to quiet the rising panic in his chest. Where were the people? What was he supposed to find here? He pulled out the small camera, flicking it on, trying to remain calm. He would take what he could, anything to piece together the truth. As he crept down another hallway, his eyes caught sight of something, a faint glow coming from beneath a door at the far end. His pulse spiked. This was it. The answers he'd been searching for. With careful movements, he made his way toward the door, his hand hovering over the handle. But just as he was about to push it open, a sound stopped him cold. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Someone was coming. His heart leaped into his throat. He needed to get out. Now, he dashed to a nearby room, pressing his back against the wall, holding his breath. The footsteps grew louder, closer. The door to the room was only a few feet away, but he had no way of knowing if the person would walk right past or check the room. He waited. The seconds stretched into eternity. Finally, the footsteps stopped. The man could hear a faint murmur of voices in the hallway. He peeked around the corner, trying to get a glimpse of who was out there. Two figures passed by, unaware of his presence. He exhaled slowly, relief washing over him for a split second. But he knew it wasn't over. The danger was just beginning. He had to move. He couldn't afford to waste another second. Taking one last look at the hallway, he slipped out of the room and into the next corridor, moving with purpose. He needed to find whatever they were hiding here, whatever evidence he could use to expose the truth. But as he rounded a corner, something caught his eye. A door, slightly ajar. Inside, a set of metal cabinets lined the walls. Files, stacks of papers. This was it. His hands trembled as he moved closer, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. He pulled open the first drawer, the papers inside old and yellowed. His eyes scanned the documents, his heart racing with each word. Names, dates, locations. He was finding everything he needed. He quickly snapped photos of the pages, each one a key piece of the puzzle. But then, the sound of a door slamming echoed down the hallway. Footsteps again. Closer. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Had they found him? No, he couldn't be caught now. Not when he was so close. He grabbed the stack of files, stuffing them into his bag, and darted toward the back exit. The seconds ticked by, each one like an eternity. As he slipped out into the alley, the weight of what he'd just uncovered hit him. The truth was in his hands, but the fight was far from over. The man's chest heaved as he ran, his feet pounding against the cracked pavement. The adrenaline surged through his veins, every step taking him farther from the building and the truth he had just uncovered. But his relief was short-lived. He could hear them now. Footsteps, shouts, a low, urgent voice calling out in the distance. He glanced over his shoulder, his heart skipping a beat. They were following him. He pushed himself harder, weaving through alleyways, trying to shake the growing fear that gripped him. The papers he had stolen were a small but vital victory, but they wouldn't be enough to stop the ones hunting him. Not by a long shot. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he fumbled to pull it out. It was a message from the woman, the one who had helped him get this far. Get to the safe house. Now, he didn't need to read it twice. His hands shook as he shoved the phone back into his pocket and turned sharply onto a side street, his breath coming in ragged bursts. The safe house. He had no idea where it was, no idea who was waiting for him there. But it was his only chance. He darted between buildings, moving faster than he thought possible, the cold night air stinging his lungs. Every sound, every echo was amplified, his senses on high alert. He had to stay ahead of them, had to make it to safety. He turned another corner and stopped dead in his tracks. A figure stood ahead of him in the shadows, blocking his path. For a moment, he froze, unable to process what he was seeing. It was a man tall, with a dark jacket and a face obscured by a hood. The man took a step forward. "I wouldn't go that way if I were you," the stranger said, his voice low and calm. The man's heart raced. Who is this? An ally? Or one of them? "I'm just trying to get to the safe house," he said, his voice strained. The stranger tilted his head. "The safe house," he said, almost as if amused. "You think they'll let you get there that easily?" The man's blood ran cold. You know who I'm running from?" he asked, his voice trembling. The stranger's lips curled into a tight smile. "I know exactly who's after you, and you're not going to outrun them." The man's mind whirled. He didn't have time for games. "Then what do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice rising in panic. The stranger's eyes gleamed in the dark. "I'm not here to stop you. I'm here to help you." The man frowned, confused. "Help me?" "Yes," the stranger said, taking another step forward. "You need to trust me. If you want to stay alive, you'll follow me." The man's instinct screamed at him to run, to escape, but there was no time for hesitation. He had come this far. He had to trust someone. "Fine," he said, his voice hard with resolve. "Lead the way." Without another word, the stranger turned and began walking down the alley. The man followed, every muscle in his body tense, ready for anything. The sound of footsteps grew louder behind him. Closer. He glanced over his shoulder, but saw nothing. The stranger didn't seem worried, but the man's anxiety only grew. They made their way through narrow, winding streets until they came to an old building hidden from the main road. The stranger stopped at the door, knocking twice. A moment later, the door creaked open. A woman stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Is he ready?" the stranger asked, his voice quiet. The woman nodded, stepping aside to let them in. The man entered cautiously, glancing around the dimly lit room. There were people inside, some sitting at a table, others standing by the walls. All of them looked like they were waiting for something, their eyes sharp with purpose. "You're safe here," the woman said, her voice soft but commanding. "You're not safe anywhere," the stranger muttered, his eyes scanning the room. The man swallowed hard. "Who are you people?" he asked. The woman looked at him, her eyes cold but not unkind. "We're the ones who've been fighting the system. The ones who refuse to let the truth die." "Fighting?" he repeated. The woman nodded. "You think you're the only one? There's more of us. And we've been tracking the same people for years." The man's head was spinning. It was all too much. How could this be real? "Then why hasn't anyone stopped them?" he asked, his voice cracking. The woman's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "Because we've had to fight in the shadows," she said. "And you're just starting to realize how deep this runs." The man felt a chill run down his spine. He had just stepped into a world he barely understood. A world where nothing was what it seemed, and there was no way out. not unless he was willing to risk everything. And right now, everything seemed to be slipping through his fingers. The room was thick with tension, the weight of the woman's words sinking in. The man stood frozen, trying to process everything. The truth he thought he was getting closer to was now more complicated than he had ever imagined. These people, whoever they were, knew things he couldn't even begin to understand. His head swam with questions, but before he could ask, the stranger's voice interrupted. "We don't have much time." The man turned sharply to face him. "What do you mean?" The stranger's face was hard, his eyes sharp. "The people after you, they know you're still alive. They know you're trying to expose them, and they won't stop until they bury you again." The man's breath caught in his throat. He had already been buried once, framed, imprisoned, robbed of his freedom. And now they were coming for him again. The woman stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "You need to act fast," she said. "The files you have, the evidence you've uncovered, it's crucial. But it's not enough on its own. You have to get it to the right people. People who can actually make it count." He nodded slowly. Every instinct told him to run, to leave it all behind. But the stakes were too high, and the truth was finally within his grasp. "Where do I go?" he asked, his voice tight. The woman's eyes flickered to the stranger, who gave a brief nod before turning to the man. "We've set up a meeting with someone who can help you," he said. "But you have to get there alone. No one can follow you. It's too risky." The man hesitated. Alone? After everything that had happened, was he really ready to trust strangers in the shadows, much less go out on his own? But the moment stretched, and he realized he had no choice. "I'll go," he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty that gnawed at him. The woman gave him a nod of approval. "Good. We'll send you the location. You don't have much time. Stay out of sight, keep moving, and whatever you do, don't trust anyone you don't know." The stranger stepped forward. "There's one last thing," he said, his voice low. "They'll have someone watching you. If you see anyone unfamiliar, don't hesitate. Take them out." The man's blood ran cold. Take them out. He wasn't a killer. He was just trying to survive. But he couldn't ignore the truth he had uncovered. The people who had betrayed him. He had to push forward no matter the cost. "I understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The stranger's eyes softened for a moment. "Good luck," he said. And just like that, the woman and the stranger vanished into the shadows, leaving him alone in the dimly lit room. The man stood still for a moment, his pulse pounding in his ears. This was it. The next step in a dangerous game that had no rules. He had no idea if he would make it out of this alive, but he knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back now. He had to see this through. He grabbed the bag with the stolen files, the weight of it heavy in his hands. Every page inside was a piece of the puzzle, but the pieces weren't enough. He needed to expose the entire system, and time was running out. The door creaked open, and he stepped into the night. The world outside was quiet. Too quiet. Every corner, every shadow, seemed to hold a hidden danger. He couldn't stop now. He had to keep moving, even if the path ahead was filled with threats he couldn't see. The only thing that mattered was the truth, and he was going to make sure it was exposed no matter what. Because the moment the truth was out in the open, there would be no place for the people who had framed him. No place for the lies that had ruined his life. No place for the ones who had betrayed him. But as he walked down the darkened street, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. And it wasn't just a feeling. Someone was following him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, his senses screaming that he wasn't alone. He quickened his pace, his footsteps, now a hurried rhythm against the silent night. But every time he glanced over his shoulder, there was nothing there. No one. He pushed the feeling aside. It could be paranoia. After everything he'd been through, his mind was playing tricks on him. Still, he couldn't shake the sense that something, or someone, was just a step behind him. The streetlights ahead flickered, casting strange, elongated shadows on the pavement. The weight of the bag, filled with the stolen evidence, felt heavier with each passing second. He had to get to the rendezvous point, had to get the truth to the right people. Suddenly, a noise echoed in the distance. A soft rustling, then the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Too measured, too deliberate. They were closing in. His heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just paranoia. Someone was following him. His breath came in short gasps, but he forced himself to remain calm. Stay focused. He took a quick turn down an alley, his mind racing. Should he keep running or confront them? The footsteps grew louder, closer, too close. He rounded another corner, pressing his back against the cold brick wall, holding his breath, praying that whoever was after him would pass by without noticing. The silence seemed to stretch on forever. Then, a figure appeared at the end of the alley. The man's heart stopped. It was a shadow, tall and unrecognizable, moving with a purpose. He ducked back deeper into the alley, heart hammering in his chest. Was this it? Was he about to be caught? He had to think fast. He couldn't let them take him now. He pulled out the burner phone from his pocket, his fingers shaking as he dialed the number from the woman's message. The phone rang once, twice. Finally, someone picked up. "Are you there?" A voice whispered urgently on the other end. "Yes," he breathed, trying to keep his voice steady. "I think they're following me." "We know," the voice responded. "Just keep moving. Do not stop. We're tracking you." He swallowed hard. He could hear footsteps getting closer. He had no more time. "Where am I supposed to go?" he asked, panic creeping into his voice. "There's a truck waiting for you 2 blocks down. It's our last shot at getting you out of there." He nodded, though the person on the other end couldn't see him. "I'm coming," he said quickly, hanging up. His breath was ragged now, fear and desperation pushing him forward. He had to make it to that truck. Just 2 more blocks. His pulse raced as he glanced once more at the approaching shadow. No time. No more chances. With a burst of adrenaline, he sprinted. The alley seemed to stretch out in front of him, the concrete underfoot feeling like a minefield. Every footstep behind him was louder, closer. But he couldn't slow down. Not now. His lungs burned, his body screaming with exhaustion. But he pushed on. 2 blocks. The truck. He didn't dare look behind him, but the sound of footsteps seemed to grow fainter, as if the pursuer was losing ground. His breath hitched with hope. He was almost there, almost free. The alley opened into a street, wide and empty. There, at the end of the road, he saw it. A dark truck, parked near the curb. A man stood by it, scanning the area. It was them, the people who had been tracking him, keeping him alive, and now they were offering his last chance. He pushed himself harder, his legs burning with the effort. He was almost there. Just as he reached the truck, a sharp voice shouted from behind. "Stop!" He turned his head, but the movement was just enough for him to miss the figure running toward him from the other direction. He barely saw it coming. A flash of movement, then a sudden, sharp pain in his side. The world tilted as he stumbled, his knees buckling beneath him. The truck door was open, but he couldn't reach it. He fell to the ground, his vision blurring as the pain in his side grew unbearable. "Get in," someone shouted. A hand grabbed him, pulling him toward the truck. But everything was spinning now. His breath was ragged. His head was spinning. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the silhouette of a man watching from the shadows. And then nothing. Darkness swallowed him whole. For what felt like hours, he drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind a haze of fragmented thoughts. Pain, voices, a faint, constant hum. Was it the sound of an engine? His eyes fluttered open, only to snap shut again as the bright light hurt his head. Slowly, he forced them open again, squinting against the overwhelming brightness. He was lying on a seat, the rough fabric beneath him uncomfortable but real. A truck. The sound of the engine rumbled through the air. He could feel the movement beneath him as the truck rolled down the road. He was alive, but alive. He took a shallow breath, the pain in his side flaring again as his body screamed for him to stay still. A figure appeared above him, someone he didn't recognize. "Take it easy," the man said, his voice low but calm. "You're safe for now." The man tried to speak, but his throat was dry, his mouth too parched. The stranger handed him a bottle of water, and with trembling hands he drank. "Where?" he rasped, his voice hoarse. The stranger gave him a sympathetic look. "You're in the truck, heading to a safe house. We've got you covered for now." The words didn't make sense to him at first. Safe house. He had barely escaped with his life just moments ago. But now he was in a truck, heading somewhere safe, somewhere they could hide him from the people still chasing him. "The others," the man muttered, his mind racing. "The ones after me, they won't find you. Not yet. We've got a plan in place." The stranger's words were reassuring, but the man wasn't sure he believed them. How could they be sure? His mind kept flashing back to the figure who had attacked him, the sharp pain in his side that still throbbed with every breath. I have the evidence," the man murmured. "The files." The stranger nodded, his expression serious. "We know. That's why you're a target." The man's heart sank. "I need to get those files to the right people," he said, panic creeping into his voice. Before it's too late." The stranger paused, looking at him intently. "We're doing everything we can. You just need to focus on healing, on staying alive, for now." The man felt a jolt of frustration. Healing? How could he focus on that when so much was at stake? The truth, his life was hanging by a thread. He couldn't afford to waste time. He couldn't afford to trust anyone. "I can't stop," he said, his voice firm despite the ache in his body. "I need to." But before he could finish, the truck suddenly jerked, throwing him back against the seat. The sound of screeching tires pierced the air, and the man's heart skipped a beat. The truck swerved, the motion sharp and disorienting. Someone was attacking them. He tried to sit up, but the pain in his side overwhelmed him, and he fell back, gasping. The stranger swore under his breath and grabbed the wheel, steering the truck sharply to the right. But the truck's tires screamed against the pavement, the vehicle skidding, barely staying on track. The man's pulse raced. Who was after them now? The truck's headlights flickered as they veered off the main road, heading into a dimly lit side street. The engine roared in protest as the driver pushed the truck harder, trying to outrun whatever was chasing them. Through the rearview mirror, the man could make out a dark figure, a car, pursuing them at high speed. His mind raced. Had they been followed? Were these people working with the ones who framed him? He couldn't afford to take any more chances. "Hold on," the stranger growled, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The truck shot forward, hurtling down the narrow street. Every turn seemed to bring them closer to the edge of a cliff. The sound of the pursuing car's engine roared louder, right behind them. The man's heart pounded. He could hear the screeching of tires, the sound of metal grinding against metal. It was happening again. They were not safe, not even close. He glanced around the truck, searching for anything that might help. A weapon, something to fight back. But there was nothing. He had nothing but the knowledge that the people who had destroyed his life were right behind him, closing in. The stranger's hands tightened on the wheel, and the truck swerved again, narrowly missing an oncoming car. The chase was far from over. The truck's tires screeched as it took another sharp turn, barely avoiding a pile of debris on the side of the road. The engine roared with fury, but the car behind them was relentless. It was closing in. The man gritted his teeth, sweat beading on his forehead. Every turn they made, every desperate acceleration, seemed to only bring the car closer. The stranger's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, his jaw tight, with concentration. "We're not outrunning them," he muttered under his breath. The man's heart pounded harder. What were they going to do? He glanced at the door handle, his mind racing for an escape plan, anything that would give them even a moment's chance. He didn't have a gun, didn't have anything to defend himself, but he had the files that could destroy everything the people after him had built. The truth was in his hands, and they weren't going to let him go without a fight. The truck lurched again, and the man was thrown against the seat. They had hit something, an abandoned vehicle or a guardrail. He wasn't sure, but the truck bounced back, the wheels momentarily losing grip on the road. His vision blurred, and for a second it felt like everything was slowing down. The car was just a few feet away now, its headlights blinding. The stranger cursed, slamming his foot on the gas pedal again, forcing the truck to jerk forward. But it wasn't enough. The car was right on their tail, inches away. The man could hear the screeching tires, the desperate attempts to close the gap. He swallowed hard. He had to act, before it was too late. Without thinking, he yanked open the door, feeling the cold night air rush in. The stranger shouted at him, but it was too late. The man leaped from the truck, rolling onto the pavement as he hit the ground hard. Pain shot through his body, but he didn't stop. He had to move. He could feel the car screeching behind him, hear the engine roaring as it tried to avoid hitting him. His legs burned as he scrambled to his feet, his body fighting against the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. The truck's engine faded, but the car was still too close. He dove into a narrow alleyway, hoping the darkness would help hide him from the pursuers. His breath was ragged, and his side throbbed with pain, but he pushed on. Every step felt like it might be his last, but he couldn't afford to stop now. He had made it this far. He couldn't fail now. The alley twisted and turned, but it seemed to stretch on endlessly, the darkness swallowing him whole. Behind him, the car's headlights flickered, but it wasn't gaining on him, yet. He didn't dare look back. He could hear footsteps, muffled by the walls of the alley, getting closer. They were after him. They wouldn't stop. He had to make it to the rendezvous point. But as he reached the end of the alley, something caught his eye. A shadow, a person, a figure standing at the corner, blocking his way. The man's heart skipped a beat. Had he just run into another trap? He couldn't tell who it was. Too dark, too late. The figure didn't move, just stood there watching him. He slowed, his breathing heavy as he stepped cautiously forward. Then, in the eerie quiet of the night, the person spoke, their voice calm but commanding. Not so fast. The man froze, every nerve in his body on high alert. Was this one of them? "Who are you?" he asked, his voice strained. The figure stepped into the dim light, and the man's eyes widened in shock. It wasn't a threat. It was someone he knew, someone from his past. "Surprised to see me," the woman said with a faint smile. His mind raced, confusion flooding him. But the pieces didn't fit. It couldn't be. Not now. Why are you here?" he managed to say, his voice shaky. The woman's eyes softened. "I'm here to help," she said, "but you're running out of time." The man stared at her, the question burning in his chest. Was she an ally? Or was she the one who had set him up from the beginning? He had to make a decision. The car was still coming. The truth was still out there, waiting to be exposed. But his life was hanging by a thread. He couldn't trust anyone, not even her. The woman stood there, waiting for him to respond, her expression unreadable in the dim light. The man's heart raced, each beat louder than the last. His breath was shallow as he tried to process what was happening. This could be the moment where everything changed, but he couldn't let himself trust her. Not yet. The car was still coming. He could hear its engine growling in the distance. closing in on him. He needed to make a decision fast. She took a step forward, breaking the silence. Don't make the mistake of thinking you're alone in this. They've been watching you. All along. He flinched. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. So it was true. They had been following him even now. He gritted his teeth, fighting against the panic bubbling inside him. I don't need your help, he snapped, his voice strained. But even as he said it, he knew the truth. He needed something, someone. The woman's eyes softened. You don't understand, do you? The people you're up against, they're not just after you. The man stared at her, his thoughts spinning. What do you mean? The files, she continued. They're after everyone connected to them. Everyone who knows what they've done. You're just one piece of the puzzle, and they won't stop until they've silenced everyone. His blood ran cold. He had known the stakes were high, but this was more than he could have imagined. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for everyone else who had been wronged, for every person they'd hurt. The car was getting closer. He could see its headlights now, cutting through the darkness. There wasn't much time left. He looked back at the woman. I don't know if I can trust you, he whispered. She met his gaze, her voice steady. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to survive. Without another word, she turned and started running, motioning for him to follow. He hesitated for just a moment before sprinting after her, the pain in his side flaring again. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the truth was so close. They ran through the narrow alley, the sound of the car's engine reverberating off the walls. Every step was a race against time. The woman led him to a small, unmarked door hidden in the shadows of a building. She threw it open, pulling him inside. The man's chest heaved as he entered, his eyes adjusting to the dim light inside. And then he saw it. The room was full of people. People who knew. People who had been waiting. The woman turned to him, her voice a whisper. This is the only place where they can't reach us. For now. The door slammed shut behind them, and for the first time in a long while, the man felt a glimmer of hope. But it wouldn't last long, because he knew, deep down, that the fight was far from over. The truth might be within reach, but so were the people who would stop at nothing to keep it hidden. And this was just the beginning. The door slammed shut, and for a moment, all the man could hear was the pounding of his own heart. The room was dimly lit, but there was a strange calm here. People moved quietly in the shadows, their eyes filled with the same determination he felt deep in his bones. The weight of everything that had happened seemed to lift slightly in this place, where the air felt less oppressive, less charged with the danger that had been following him every step. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The woman who had led him here stepped into the center of the room, her eyes meeting his. They can't find us here, at least not yet, she said, her voice steady, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes. Fear? Hope. He wasn't sure, but he knew one thing for certain. She had given him the chance to make a difference, to expose everything, to give the world the truth. He had the files that could bring down the powerful people who had destroyed everything, the people who had framed him, and just maybe the people who were responsible for more than just his suffering. He took a deep breath, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline. They won't stop coming, he said, his voice low. They'll keep hunting me until they have those files. The woman nodded, her expression hardening. We're ready, she said simply, but we need you to stay focused. You can't let fear take over now. Not when the truth is within reach. The man nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. He was tired, but he wasn't beaten. Not yet. He glanced around the room, seeing the faces of the people who had risked everything to help him. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope that the truth would finally be exposed. Hope that they could fight back, that they could end this nightmare once and for all. The road ahead was uncertain, and he knew the danger wasn't over. But with the files in his possession and a new, unlikely group of allies, he wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. As he turned to follow the woman toward the back room, a small but powerful thought echoed in his mind. He had survived, and he would make sure they would never silence him or the truth again.